Hello and welcome to Canguro English. My name is Christian and today is Tuesday, the best day of the week. Today I am going to be destroying common language myths, especially grammar myths. And I want to divide these myths into three categories. So the first category is myths based on history, bad understanding of language. The second category is myths based on misunderstanding the psychology of language. And the final category is myths based on lies and marketing that is used by people to sell products and sell courses and sell books and sell exams. Okay, so let's look at two myths from the first category. So these are myths based on the history of English. And the first one is this. Hi Christian, could you please tell us about prepositions at the end of a sentence? There are so many students and also teachers who have this idea in their mind that it's wrong to end a sentence in English with a preposition. And I think it's useful to try to understand where this myth came from. And it probably came from a guy called Joshua Poole, who wrote a book about English usage. And in the book, he wrote this. If a phrase seems hard in English to be turned into Latin, turn it into some other English of the like sense. And this is typical of the attitude of people at the time. So, in the past, there were scholars and other educated people who wanted English to be like Latin, because Latin was the language of education and scholarly thought, and it was the language of royalty, right? And so in the past, these people, they tried to kind of take English and manipulate it so it would fit into the structure of Latin, because Latin was the perfect language. But the problem is that English isn't Latin, and it doesn't fit in the Latin structure. But in Latin, you cannot end a sentence with a preposition. So this one guy said, hey, we probably shouldn't do the same thing in English. And here we are 400 years later with the same idea in our heads. And this idea has no reason to exist apart from this guy saying it. And you'll notice this is a common theme. It just takes one person to create this myth. And I'll explain to you why it's ridiculous. So imagine you say to me, I sat on a woofly blurb. And I'm like, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? You say, I sat on a woofly blurb. And I say, I don't understand what you're saying. What did you sit on? Now, this sentence ends in a preposition. What did you sit on? Now, if we follow this rule, that we shouldn't end a sentence in English with a preposition, then what we need to say is, on what did you sit? Now, sure, you could do this, but nobody talks like this. If you talked like that, people would think that you had some type of, problem, that you'd learned English, 500 years ago. And so in English, it's absolutely necessary sometimes to end a sentence with with a preposition. So please understand that this rule has no basis in reality. Next question. Hey mates, I've been thinking about phrasal verbs and I have a question. In a work environment, as a business company, for example, to talk using phrasal verbs is considered unprofessional or amateurish. Now, again, this is a very similar thing. This is the idea that there are some types of language, some types of grammatical constructions that are formal, and other types that are informal. And again, when we look at the history, normally it's just one person saying we shouldn't do this. And then this one person generates a lot of influence, and here we are, hundreds of years later, with these ideas in our head that we shouldn't do that, and we don't even really know why. For example, a lot of people think that we shouldn't use the passive. The passive is bad. Where did we get that from? The Elements of Style by Strunk and White. Again, it was just a guy who gave his opinion. It's not law. That's not how language works. And it's the same thing with phrasal verbs. People have this idea that phrasal verbs are informal and the Latin single word verbs are more formal. Now, there is not really any evidence that that is true. And in fact, there are some single word Latin verbs that have no phrasal verb equivalent. They can't be substituted. And the opposite is true. There are some phrasal verbs that have no single word Latinate equivalent. We must use the phrasal verb. But this doesn't really answer the question about formal and informal. So I have this really great research paper here, which is by Ken Hyland and Kevin Jiang, and they asked the question, is academic writing becoming more formal? And what's great about it is in the paper they list 10 things that are considered by some style guides to be informal, right? And just so you know, the passive voice and phrasal verbs are not on this list, okay? But the 10 things include, for example, using first-person pronouns, using sentence initial conjunctions, using sentence final prepositions, all right? Listing expressions, and direct questions and exclamations. Now, if we look at the list, if we look at the general idea of the list, there is one definition for formal versus informal. And the definition is basically formal language is specific and informal language is vague. And if you understand that concept, then you understand the difference between formal and informal language. Formal and informal language isn't really about specific grammatical constructions and specific vocabulary and, word order. No. Formal language is about being specific. So, for example, one of the things on the list is when you create a list, you should not say, etc. Right? So imagine I'm writing a scientific paper. I don't say, well, we tested the boys and we tested the girls, etc. No, that's not good enough because in a formal scientific paper, we need detail. We need you to be specific. I need to know exactly what what you're listing, what you're testing. And so that's why that's considered an informal feature. And again, the same thing, first-person pronouns. If I'm writing a scientific paper, I don't say, I tested the liquid. No, because we need to be more specific about who. It may not be I, it might be the team. It might be my research associate Maria. It might be even more specific than that. So it's about being specific. That's the difference between formal and informal language. Now let's look at the next category, which is myths based on not understanding the psychology of language. And let's look at this question. What's the proper order? Turn on the power of choice or turn the power of choice on. Now, you may or may not know that in English we have these phrasal verbs, okay? And some of these phrasal verbs we can separate, and some of them we can't. But if we can separate a phrasal verb, it means that we can put the object of the verb here in the middle. Like in this example, we can turn the power of choice on, or we can turn on the power of choice. And the question is, when do we split and when do we not split? What's the difference? Well, there's no right and wrong rule. Okay, there's no right and wrong. It's about psychology. It's about how we kind of process language. So the first thing is that if the object of the verb is very long, if it's a very long phrase, a very long construction, then we probably don't want to put it in the middle, because then the distance between this verb, which has one meaning, the distance is so big that maybe we forget the meaning of the verb. Like, for example, I want you to turn the red switch next to the door, which is at the bottom of the stairs on the left of the toilet, on. Well, by the time you finish telling me the object of the verb, I've forgotten this meaning. So if it's long, should probably put it at the end, because it's easier for me to process. That makes sense, right? That's logical. Psychology. But there's another part of psychology. Imagine we have a short phrase, like in the example, the power of choice. Now, we can put it here or here. We have two options. But in general, in English, if we bring something to the front, okay, if we bring it closer to the beginning of the sentence, it's more powerful. We pay more attention to it. We give it more emphasis. So psychologically, when I'm processing the sentence, if you say, turn the power of choice on, the power of choice is more salient to me. My focus, my emphasis is on power of choice. Whereas if you say, turn on the power of choice, my focus is much more on the process of turning something on this part. Simple question of psychology, and again, that's just the way that English works. Next question. Which is the right form of future in this situation? I didn't pass my English test. My parents will not be happy, or my parents are not going to be happy. Will or going to? The eternal question about the future. Now, again, this isn't a question of right or wrong. I don't care what they wrote in your grammar book. This isn't about right or wrong. This is about psychology. So I need to tell you something a little bit kind of crazy about the human brain. Okay, so the past definitely happened, right? The past is real. But the future, well, the future isn't real. We don't know what's going to happen. All we can do is make predictions. And we live now in the present. But there's something really interesting about the human brain, which is the past is just as much imagination as the future. We think that our memories of the past are so real and perfect and true, but actually they're not. Our brain has to recreate and imagine the past just as much as it has to do for the future. In fact, there's been some research where they were able to convince people that in the past they had committed a crime, even though they hadn't. That's psychology, because your brain can recreate and imagine things that never even happened. So really, here we are living in the moment, and past and future is just imagination. Some type of matrix world we create in our minds. And so, when we decide between using will and going to, again, it's about psychology. Now, these are basically two different types of predictions. Will is a strong prediction, something which you are quite sure is going to happen. Going to is a prediction based on present evidence. It's strongly linked to now. It's present continuous. So if you say, your parents will be angry, well, I'm making a strong prediction. I'm almost 100% sure that your parents are not going to be happy about you failing that exam. But when I use going to, what I'm doing is I'm saying, come here into this moment with me. Let's look at the evidence. Let's look at your exam results. Your parents are not going to be happy. Because I'm looking at what's happening now, and recreating the future. So I know that there are lots of grammar books that talk about the difference being decision now, plans already made versus decision now. But if you look at, corpora of the way that people use the future tense in English, there's no rule, okay? It's all about psychology. So don't believe what your grammar book tells you. Now, the final category, myths about language based on lies and marketing used to sell products. Let's look at this one. Somebody told me that if you can memorize 3,000 vocabulary words, you will be fluent. But what are those words? Can anyone suggest a good reference for the well-known and common words? Okay, I have to tell you the truth. The truth is that you need to know 3,003 words to be fluent in English. If only it was true. There is zero correlation between how many words you know and your fluency. And my favorite example is the New Zealand Scrabble player Nigel Richards. He is a native English speaker, lives in New Zealand, and he won the French Scrabble Championships. He memorized the French dictionary. Memorized it. He cannot speak French. Zero French. Zero. There's no relation between size of vocabulary and fluency. Why? Because fluency is a result of practice. You need much more than just vocabulary to be fluent. You need to have automatic control of the grammar structures that you can then put vocabulary in. You need to be able to pronounce the words, in an understandable way. You need to have all of these things be automatic. And that only comes from practice. But that doesn't mean that the entire question is bad, because it is good and useful to have a good vocabulary list that contains high-frequency words. Because Zipf's law tells us that, the top kind of 1,000 words makes up like 90% of language. So it's a great, a good word list is a good starting point. And there are lots of good word lists, especially on Paul Nation's website. I will put a link down below in the description box. And the final question. Dear Christian, let me make a question. When is the best time for a child to start learning English? My question is because my daughter is 6 years old, but she did not start her first year at standard school. I mean, she isn't alphabetized yet. Could be a waste of time to start right now. Here's the truth. The truth is that the best time for anybody to start learning English was the day they were born. And the second best time is right now. Because language ability comes from, practice. So the more years you have of practice, the more time you have spent with the language, the better your language will be. It's a very simple formula. But time in years is meaningless. For example, I could study English for 6 years and go to class once a month. Ooh, he's been studying English for 6 years. No, it's not really about years, it's about how many hours are you spending learning the language. And on top of that, what type of studying are you doing? Because I could spend 1,000 hours memorizing vocabulary and have zero fluency. That would be a bad use of my time, bad studying, bad pedagogy, bad methodology, right? So there's things that are important. Lots of hours and good technique. And this myth is based in the kind of idea that children are much better at learning languages than adults. It's just not true. If you put a child and an adult together and you test them in all of the cognitive areas, memory, short-term memory, working memory, problem solving, all of these things, adults are better than children. Of course. The reason that children are so much more successful at learning a language is because they have no choice, right? Everybody learns their first language because they need it to survive. As an adult learning a second language, you just don't have the same need. You don't have the same pressure. It takes a really special adult to devote the time and the energy necessary to learn a language to the same level as a child does. Because adults are busy with other things. Coffee, beer, Netflix. So, I want you to realize that it's never too late. Adults can also be fantastic at learning languages. And if your daughter is 6 years old, that is absolutely not too late to have great language. The question is, are you and your daughter willing to put in the time necessary? And I hope you are, because the rewards of speaking a second language are great. Well, I hope you enjoyed this destruction of myths about grammar and language. I'm Christian, this is Canguro English, and I'll see you in class.